Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the next of our recordings about the Reconstruction period in American history. There's, I think, three or four total, which means we have either one or two more to go. Since I'm the one that put these together, you would think I would have actually figured that out, but I honestly can't remember right offhand. So in our previous section, we talked about Reconstruction in the very, very early stages, right? Wartime Reconstruction leading up to the end of the war, and then the real tragedy of the high of ending the war on April 9th, and then within a week, the terrible, terrible low of Lincoln being assassinated. And this is really going to throw Reconstruction into a bit of chaos, right? How are we going to manage this plan, especially given that the person who is now in charge of Reconstruction is sort of mentally, psychologically, politically not the best qualified person to do that. And that is Andrew Johnson. And this is a picture of Andrew Johnson. Here, he looks certainly like somebody you would want to go to the bar with and hang out and just shoot the breeze. Looks like a really, really fun guy. That's basically the way Johnson looked all the time, right? He was not a very pleasant individual. He was extremely stubborn. He was convinced that he had all of the powers of wartime presidential authority that Lincoln had had during the Civil War itself. And so he's constantly butting heads with Congress. Johnson is an interesting president. He's often ranked down towards the bottom in historical lists of American presidents. Usually not the worst, but definitely in the sort of bottom five. And Johnson is Lincoln's vice president for his second term, right? He's not the vice president for Lincoln's first term, but he becomes vice president partially because he represents a way to smooth the transition towards Reconstruction. He is actually a Democrat, which is kind of surprising and kind of unusual, right? Usually, presidents and presidential candidates will select their vice presidential running mate from their own party. Lincoln is a Republican, and so one would expect that he would choose another Republican to serve in his vice presidency. Johnson, though, is a Democrat. Johnson is also a Southerner, right? He's from Tennessee, so he is a Southern Democrat. And we didn't go into it a lot, but historically speaking, the Southern Democrats were in many ways the ones who were responsible for pushing the country closer and closer and closer to the war, especially during the 1850s. And so this is a bit of a surprising choice, right, for Lincoln to select this individual to be his vice presidential running mate in the election of 1864. Johnson was appointed to be the governor of Tennessee. By 1862, Tennessee was pretty much entirely under Union control. And so Lincoln decides to replace the Confederate government that had been installed in Tennessee at the start of the war. He decides to replace that government and make Andrew Johnson the acting governor of Tennessee. And so he had some political experience. If I remember right, he had been a senator from Tennessee. So he wasn't a complete amateur at politics at either the state level or the national level. In terms of his ideology, though, this is where Johnson really becomes a fascinating kind of figure, especially for our purposes. We tend to think, especially of Southerners, as Well, you know, if you were white and you were in the South, you wanted slavery. And typically, we tend to think if you were white and you were in the South, you owned slaves. And that wasn't the case. About half to a third of the Southern population did not own slaves. It was actually very expensive to own a slave, let alone multiple slaves. And so the ideas, the kind of stereotypes that we have about, excuse me, about Southern life that say, you know, it's sort of like Gone with the Wind or something like that, where we imagine these plantations with really, really, really rich plantation owners who are living with the constant labor, either domestic labor or field labor or manual labor of slaves in the dozens or hundreds. That's the exception to the rule. Most Southerners, if you owned a slave, it was one, maybe two people. And many, 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 many thousands of Southerners did not own slaves at all. Now, none of this obviously is to try to poo-poo slavery as an institution or to make it sound like it wasn't a completely immoral act. It's just to kind of put context into how it all worked. Johnson, personally, was from a very poor white Southern family. Johnson represents a fairly common personality type in the 1800s that is, I hate slavery, but I'm a white supremacist, right? I hate slavery as an institution, as an economic tool, but I thoroughly and completely believe that whites are intellectually, psychologically, emotionally superior to non-whites. So this is a really odd kind of thing from our perspective, because we think, well, if you're a white supremacist, wouldn't you approve of slavery? But from Johnson's perspective, slavery as an institution is responsible for the hierarchy that exists in Southern society. So in other words, plantation owners in particular are vastly wealthy individuals, right? Their lifestyle is completely alien to the majority of Southerners. Most Southerners, just like today, most people don't live in huge mansions and ride around in, you know, Bentleys and Lamborghinis. That's the equivalent of the plantation owners that we tend to think about when we imagine Southern slavery and the Southern economy. Johnson hated that, and he recognized that a lot of that was built on the backs, literally and figuratively or metaphorically, on the backs of slaves and the slave system. And so he says, I, as a poor white Southerner, shouldn't have to be restricted in my opportunities politically, socially, or economically because of the existence of this kind of plantation aristocracy that gets its power and gets its wealth because of the slave system. At the very same time, though, somewhat hypocritically and paradoxically, Johnson says, but I want to benefit from a Southern society that clearly distinguishes whites as superior to non-whites. So no matter how poor Johnson is, as a white person, he is still on a higher level of that social ladder than any non-white would be. He wants that. So he wants that racial distinction. He wants that idea of white supremacy. Now, he's not, you know, he's not a Klansman. He's not dressing in white robes and burning crosses and that kind of thing. White supremacy in the fundamental sense of saying, I believe that whites are superior to non-whites, right? Johnson fits that mold. So he likes the idea of white supremacy. He likes the idea of racial inequality. He is not convinced that even with freedom, which he can't really go back on too much, he's not really convinced that even with freedom, that African Americans deserve or will get equality in society, or legally, or economically. But, you know, freedom, emancipation, that's a horse that has escaped, and you can't, you can't get him back into the barn. So there's my homey little, down to earth reference there. So Johnson, he's really not alone in this, in being somebody that says, I think slavery is wrong, not from a moral perspective, not from an ethical perspective, but from the perspective of, I don't want to constantly be competing as a poor white Southerner with either a labor system that allows a person to buy a slave and limit my opportunity to work, or I don't want to be competing with the plantation aristocracy that is able to build wealth and build power and influence on the foundation of a system that I cannot participate in, the slave economy that I can't participate in. So Johnson is very much in this, from our perspective, kind of this interesting limbo between two sides of that equation. So he's always at odds with Congress. He believes that he should be controlling Reconstruction policy without any influence or any input from congressional leadership. And so he is sort of overseeing the operation of Reconstruction that is discovering a number of challenges or a number of different difficulties. For one, the Southern states, as they would be readmitted into the Union, would experience this kind of sudden surge in political power, because in the Constitution, excuse me, in the Constitution there's what's called the 3/5 compromise. Basically, this means that going back to the 1780s, Southern states, where the vast majority of enslaved people were, Southern states would be allowed to count some of that population as part of their overall population when it comes to determining how many representatives they have in Congress, when it comes to how many electoral votes they have in choosing the president. And so what happens with the end of slavery, with the end of the 3/5 compromise, is now all of the formerly enslaved people would be counted towards that state's population. But who is getting the vote? Only whites. So in other words, white voters in South Carolina or Mississippi or Florida are getting more representatives than they would have had while slavery was in existence. And they are the only ones, those white voters, they are the only ones that are gaining from that power, gaining from that additional kind of representation. So the South is actually coming out of this in a better position in terms of Congress and in terms of their sort of influence on the electoral college. They're coming out better because the end of the 3/5 compromise. On the other side, former slaves are experiencing this really, really tragic kind of irony where they finally have freedom. For generation upon generation, that has been the oasis, that kind of mirage out there on the distance for enslaved people, right? Was one day, maybe not me, maybe not my children, but one day we will be free. And that's finally come, which is fantastic. But they don't have access to political power. They don't have any access to the government. They don't have any real legal protections. They don't have any change in status of equality. Just because they're free doesn't mean that the white people that surround them are suddenly going to think, wow, you know what? These people really are no different than we are. There really isn't any difference based on the color of skin. Maybe we should just treat them all like each other, right? Treat them like us. They're not going to think that. And so the opportunities available to freed slaves are virtually nil, right? They're not getting jobs, they're not getting property, they're not getting land. Many of them end up moving in this this really sad migration as thousands and thousands of freed slaves wander through the South trying to find family members and loved ones who had been sold away from their family at one time or another. So this is a really pitiful kind of situation where people finally have freedom. What an amazing achievement. What an amazing experience. But at the exact same instant, they don't have anything that they can live off of. And they don't have any protections to guarantee that that freedom will be preserved in the near or long-term future. And so the government organizes, initially right at the end of the war, and then lasting into the 1870s, organizes a part of the U.S. Army that's called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is a fairly small branch within the Department of War, which is responsible for providing assistance, right? Primarily food, clothing, temporary shelter, that kind of thing, to especially freed slaves. Occasionally, some of those rations and distributions go to other Southern refugees who have been displaced or uprooted as a result of the war. But it's designed to try to provide some kind of aid for the millions of people who have been affected by not only the devastation of the war, but also these very rapid, very challenging kinds of changes that have been taking place in Southern society and the Southern economy and politics and so on and so forth. It's a very, very uncoordinated kind of effort, much like we talked about with wartime Reconstruction. It is really up to the decisions of the people in particular areas, how they want to implement Freedmen's Bureau policies and how they want to distribute that aid, how far they want to go in balancing the pressures and the concerns of the former slave population versus the white population, both of whom have claims to authority or claims to support. And so it's a very, very difficult kind of thing to manage. The change in this whole process then comes in 1866 and 67. So up until this point, Johnson is really guiding Reconstruction policy. In 1866, we have a midterm election. What's a midterm election? Well, a midterm election is the election that happens in the middle of a presidential term. So you're voting for all of Congress, and now you're voting for some senators and potentially governors or state political office or things like that. But the important thing for our purposes here is that a midterm election, like 1866, the people get to vote for the entire House of Representatives, right? So it can be a hugely significant transition. Republicans in the North begin using this campaign tactic that they call waving the bloody shirt. Basically, it is, hey, voters, do you remember all of the destruction and devastation and violence and trauma and death of the Civil War? Well, remember that if you want that to mean something, if you want the next few years to live up to what that war was all about, you'll vote Republican. If you don't vote Republican, then all of the sacrifices that were made up to and including the martyrdom of our President Lincoln, all of those sacrifices will be for nothing, because our opponents will get in power and will roll everything back, and it'll be a terrible disservice to everything that was lost as a result of the war, everything that was paid as part of winning that war. And they managed this campaign tactic really up into the 1870s, and it's very, very successful, right? Lots of people say, you know what, I'm going to vote Republican because they're the ones that will carry that torch and make that war about something. So in 1866, the radical Republicans benefit from this campaign tactic, and they get large majorities in both the House and in the Senate. And they decide, we have enough people in Congress now that we can go after Johnson directly. They'd been looking for a way to attack Johnson, but they hadn't really found one, so they could resist it, could maybe cause some problems for him, couldn't really work hard to try to get him out of office. Now, almost immediately, when the new congressional class gets sworn in, when all of these beefier numbers of radical Republicans take their seats, Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act. And basically, this is a way to kind of goad Andrew Johnson into sort of hanging himself, politically speaking. And basically this says, if there is a government officer who is appointed with Senate approval, then the Senate has to also approve if that person gets fired. In other words, presidents then and now choose their cabinet. They can say, I want so-and-so to be my Secretary of State. But they don't just get that automatically. That goes through a Senate confirmation hearing. And the Senate can then say, okay, we agree with so-and-so as your Secretary of State. Go ahead. Generally speaking, if the president then would say, you know what, my Secretary of State isn't doing a good job, I'm going to fire that person. Generally speaking, if the president decides that, the Senate doesn't step in and say, no, we have to agree to that too. Normally, if the president wants to fire a cabinet member, they can do that, and that's that. The Tenure of Office Act says that at least for that time being, because it's not in effect now, at least for that time being, if the president had appointed a person, like the Secretary of State, or in this case, the Secretary of War, and wants to fire that person, the Senate says, no, we have to approve. So Johnson says, you don't have that right, Congress. I'm going to fire Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War under Lincoln. Johnson says, I didn't appoint this person. This person is working against me in my administration. I want to get rid of this person from my cabinet. So he fires the Secretary of War. He begins the process of replacing him with somebody else. And Congress says, Not allowed to do that. You have just knowingly and openly violated a congressional act, the law of the land. We are going to impeach you. So Johnson is the first president ever to be impeached. There have now been 2 others. Johnson is the first. Johnson is put through the entire process, right? The articles are voted by the House. He's put on trial in the Senate. He survives by 1 vote. 1 vote from, I believe it's a senator from Kentucky, goes in his favor, and that's enough to protect Johnson from actually being removed from office. And so Johnson is still president all the way through to the election of 1868. He gets virtually all of Lincoln's entire second term, just because of when Lincoln is assassinated. But even though Johnson is in the White House, even though he is officially president, this election of 1866, the kind of stigma that comes as a result of the impeachment means that he loses virtually all influence on Reconstruction policy. And so this is how that transition happens from presidential Reconstruction under the general authority of Johnson, how it goes from that into radical Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction, which is going to be the longest of the 3 periods, largely because Congress sort of wrestles control of Reconstruction policy away from Johnson in 1866, 1867. And so that's where we're going to look in the next section. We'll talk a little bit about the process of Congressional Reconstruction, some of the challenges that it faces, some of the issues that start to emerge increasingly surrounding race relations, and then ultimately we'll wrap up with how Reconstruction ends in 1876, 1877. So I hope everybody is doing well. Let me know if you've got questions. There were some kind of complicated things in here with the 3/5 Compromise and Tenure of Office Act and things like that. So if you've got questions about any of that, be sure to let me know, and I will see everybody very soon.